Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opus Partners. I'm your host, Tim Knight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about what does a good investment property look like? And I think this is one of the most common questions that we get asked about on YouTube and, of course, on the podcast as well. So that's what we're going to discuss. Now, Andrew, if you are going to go and buy your first investment property, what does a good investment property look like? Most people say a good yield.
Yeah, I know. And I'm going to give the answer that you hate the most. It depends, right?
Oh, well, that's it. Podcast over. It depends, everybody.
Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe.
Of course we know it depends, but we want to know, what does it depend on?
Well, that's what we're going to dig into today.
Okay. When I was thinking about this question, one of the big things is it all depends on your strategy. The sort of property you buy really depends on, well, what do you want to do with it? And I think there are two groups of strategies. We've got on-sale strategies where we buy something, we do something to the property, whether it be develop or subdivide, something along those lines, and then we sell it on. And then we've got hold strategies where we're buying something, we're holding it onto it for the long term, and we're going to get the benefits of long-term capital growth. And so if we think about what some of those like on-sale strategies are, like if we think about development, right? What sort of property are we going to be looking for, Andrew?
Yeah, so if you're looking at developing a property and then selling off some townhouses, for example, what you're going to want is something with a big piece of land, something that's zoned correctly so that you're going to be able to carve it off into multiple parcels. You're going to probably want to make sure that it's relatively flat so that when you build on it, you don't have price blowouts, and you're going to want to have good access. So these are the kind of things that if you're developing, they're really important. If I'm buying a property that I'm just going to do up, renovate, and flick on, I don't really care so much about that. Sure, access might still be important there, but I don't care about the zoning of the land. What difference does that make? I just want to be able to buy something with some good bones that I'm going to be able to turn around, renovate quickly, and put back on the market.
And that's actually where it comes to another big difference. So if we're thinking about developing, any house that is currently on there, I'm going to tear down and then I'm just going to build on top of the land. So there could be an absolute dive of a place on it. The house could be falling apart, and I'd look at that and be like, "Oh, wonderful.
Absolutely, it's cheaper to rent, cheaper to demolish,
and cheaper to buy potentially." Whereas if we think about flipping, like the mistake some people make when it comes to flipping is they look for a house that is effectively falling apart, and then say, "Oh, this is great. It's going to make such a good renovation." Generally, it doesn't, because it costs so much to do it up. You want something, as Andrew said, that has good bones, that is a little bit tired, that you can then cost effectively do up and then sell really quickly. That's what makes a good flip. Totally different from what makes a good development. You know, with development, bigger land, terrible house, that's great. With flipping, land doesn't matter so much. It's all about the house, and do you have something that you can cost effectively renovate? But that would be totally different again compared to somebody who maybe wants to subdivide and sell.
Yeah, so if you want to subdivide, then again, you're probably looking with something where you've got a big piece of land that is subdivisible, but also you want to make sure that the positioning of what's on there at the moment, the house or the units or whatever, is in such a place that you can carve off land without the house encroaching on the other piece of land.
Yeah, so you wouldn't want a house to be right smack bang in the middle of the section, because how do you subdivide anything off it? You almost want the house at the front, big back section, then you can subdivide it off. And even it comes down to titles as well. So if you think about a developer, they're never going to want to buy a cross-lease property, because then you're going to have to get consent from your neighbours to build anything, and you probably can't. It's going to be a big hassle, and on top of that, cross-lease properties tend to have smaller sections. A flipper would probably be okay with buying something that was cross-lease, as long as they don't want to change the flats plan, don't want to change where the house sits, don't want to build anything on top of it. So, you know, a cross-lease might be okay for a flipper, but definitely not for a developer.
Or a developer might buy a cross-lease with the intention of buying the other property and then having both properties together. But again, you're right. Usually smaller parcels of land.
Okay, and then that is totally different again from if we are going to look at more hold strategies. And again, there are a couple of different types of hold strategies. So one that you're using, Andrew, and myself as well, is the build and hold strategy. Just remind us what that is.
Yeah, so that's when you're going to buy a brand new property from a developer. It might be a progressive payment build or a turnkey build, and someone else is going to do all of that development work for you. You're just going to buy a property and add it to your portfolio, rent it out, and hold it long term.
Yeah, and what what are some of the factors we're going to look for if we're doing a build and hold?
Well, I want my numbers to work is probably the best thing. So I want the price to be a reasonable price, an affordable price. I want to be able to rent it out to the masses. So I kind of want it to be affordable from a rental perspective as well. I want it to be in a undervalued region. I want it to be a property where the cash flow works for me. But the biggest thing is, I want to put in as minimal money as possible and borrow as much from the bank because I want to grow my portfolio.
But I think on top of that, the other big difference is you're looking for a developer who's actually going to build something good, because whether you go through a turnkey or a progressive payment build, you are going to have to work with this developer. You're probably going to buy something off the plans if it's not completed, and then you're going to effectively trust that they're going to build what they said they're going to build. Now, some developers do that and some developers don't. Now, if you are going to use a build and hold strategy, we've got to start thinking about the developer. Now, if you're just buying something that's existing and going to renovate it, which we'll talk about in a second, you don't have that consideration. You don't even have to think about that because you're just going to buy something that's already built. And so again, what does a good deal look like? What does a good property look like? Well, it depends what the strategy is and what's actually going to fit with your lifestyle. If I change up things and we say, okay, we're going to go for a renovation strategy now, and let's say we're going to use the cash flow hacking process, which we talk about in our book, Wealth Plan. So a standard cash flow hack is you buy something that was built in the 1970s or 1980s. It's got a second lounge or it's got a separate dining room that you can carve off and turn into a extra bedroom within the house. And that's going to be one of the key parts of your cash flow hack. Maybe you can change the property. So instead of one bathroom, it's now got two bathrooms, and you can do that in a cost-effective way. So if we're using a cash flow hacking strategy, we're looking for something that was built in the 70s or 80s with a couple of these distinct features that we can cost-effectively renovate. If we're doing a build and hold strategy, we're looking for a good developer, probably something that's in a good location, probably in an undervalued region, probably in a suburb that's had historically strong capital growth, because we're all about capital growth for the long term. And so it's just so different, the buying criteria based on the strategy. So I know it's sometimes not what people want to hear, but a good investment property starts with how do you want to invest in property and how do you want to make money out of investment property?
Yeah, the property actually should be the easy part of this. It's getting everything else figured out first. I was working with an investor just the other day, and he was telling me that his wife was leading the charge with what they were going to invest in. I said, great. What is your buying criteria? And he said, she wants a 3-bedroom house, and he named a suburb. And I said, really? That's got one of the lowest historic growth for that city. He said, oh, I didn't know that. And because they hadn't set their buying criteria correctly, they just set it based on what they thought they might want to live in. They were going to go and make a poor investment decision as a result.
Yeah, and so the easiest thing to do is start with how do we want to invest in property? And this is the part that I actually see people get a bit confused about. People come in, and we'll talk to some of our financial advisors, and we deal with at the moment, about 100 couples a week, couples or singles a week, helping them decide how they want to invest and finding new build properties for them. And often people will get stuck thinking, well, should I subdivide, or should I do this, and should I develop, or should I renovate, and all of these different things. And then they think, okay, we'll just shortcut it and go look at properties, which is totally the wrong way to do it. And I suppose there's another important question, which is, how do I decide which strategy to go for? And I think there are 2 or 3 big ways to figure this out. The first is, what can you afford to do? Because some people say, I want to be a property developer. But if you're 20 years old and you don't have a cent to your name, that's going to be very difficult, nigh on impossible. So a lot of people want to develop, but it might just not be financially achievable for you because of how much money you have and how much income you have, because you have to have a lot of money to develop. Similarly, if you're going to go and renovate, that takes a bit more money than if you're going to use a build and hold strategy. So you've got to first of all figure out, well, what's actually financially achievable for me? And then I think the next question after that is going to be, well, what's actually going to fit with your lifestyle? For somebody like me, I've got no time to develop at all. But I do have some friends who, like my good friend Andrew here, who's got more time than me. And so, so he wants to start developing it. I'm going to get on his coattails. So that works for me. And so, because I just want to spend all my time in the spreadsheets, I'm just going to do a build and hold strategy.
I do think as well it's about understanding what your tolerance for risk is, but also what your ability for riskers. So what I mean by that is you might say, hey, I'm willing to take on the risk of a development, which is kind of the most risky way of investing in property, but also can be one of the most lucrative as well. And so people think, okay, I've got that in me. I can take that risk. But if you don't have a lot of time on your side, i.e. you're getting closer to retirement, you kind of can't afford to get it wrong. So I've had people who, they've got the equity to be able to develop. They maybe have a skill set because they might have been in the property industry, but they don't have the time to get it wrong. So if they enter the market at the wrong time and they either don't make money or even worse, they lose money, then that's not a good direction for them to go in.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the other things to just mention is, of course, yield comes into it too. Yield is the amount of money you get compared to the money you've invested, right? And some people say, look, for my strategy, I'm going to be renovating. I'm looking for an 8% yield minimum is sometimes what you hear. And that's where you're going to have to go and do a cash flow hack. You're going to have to go do a big renovation to do it. And then, I've got little things in me where I'm like, oh, I don't believe that they're calculating it the right way. But we'll get that.
I'm with you on that.
Oh, and I'll tell you the reason why, because we'll get into it now, Andrew, because otherwise I'm going to get it in the comments section on the YouTube and the podcast. People are going to say, what did you mean by that, Ed? So the big issue that I sometimes have with renovators is that they buy a house, they spend the money renovating it, they increase the rent, and that's really, really good. But then they say, okay, my yield is 8%. And the way that they calculate that is based on the money they spend on the house and the money they spend on the renovation. And I always think, well, that's actually not correct because you've then increased the value of that property, right? And so you've got to think about what is the yield on my asset? Not what I spent, but what is the yield on the value of my asset? Because then you can say, is the optimal financial decision to continue holding on to this property, or is the optimal financial decision to sell that property and invest my money somewhere else? So let's say that you did and this isn't to knock renovators, by the way, it's just math, because I really care about math. That's my pride and joy. I go home and watch YouTube videos about math. I
knew there had to be something you cared about.
Math and YouTube offered at the same time.
I thought you were going to say you.
No, not you. YouTube. And
They just said tube.
Where was I?
Can't remember. Math. You love math.
Math.
So you could redeploy your capital.
This got a bit cocked, didn't it? So let's say you did a really good job renovating a property. You bought it cheap, you did it up. And now, based on your spending, you got an 8% yield. You go, oh, wow, I've done such a great job. And you have. But then if you calculated it based on the current value, maybe you've increased the value of that property so much now that the yield is closer to 3%, right? Based on the value. Well, the optimal financial decision then would be to sell that property and then go buy something that was higher yielding. So you've made money through the renovation, and that's a beautiful thing, but that can sometimes mask the true yields that you've got. So I always think you've got to calculate your yield on the final asset value, because you want to know the yield on your asset rather than the yield on what you actually spent.
I also think yield's such a blunt instrument to figure out if something is a good investment or not. The reason we say yield is because it's easy for us to kind of figure out if the cash flow is going to be good. And really all we care about is the cash flow affordable? Like, i.e., is my top up going to be affordable for me, or am I going to be making a good amount of money from this investment if I've got no mortgage on it and I'm just living off the rent? So that's kind of why we say yield, but you can get a really, really high yield with a property in the West Coast, but then the rates, the insurance, the vacancy, that might cripple you, so the net yield doesn't really work out. So yield's a pretty blunt instrument to use.
And I suppose the main thing we're getting across today is when you're sitting there thinking about what does a good investment property look like, the right investment property or a good investment property looks different for everyone because it starts with your strategy. How do you want to invest in property? If you want to subdivide, you're going to be looking for a different property depending if you want to develop compared to if you want to flip, compared to if you want to trade, compared to if you want to do a build and hold strategy, compared to if you want to do a renovation strategy. So start by thinking about, how do we want to invest in property? Do we want to be actively involved where we renovate? Do we want to do an on-sell strategy where we buy something, do it up, or develop it and then sell it on? The benefit of that is you get the money straight away. The downside is you lose out on the capital growth. Or are you more interested in long-term wealth creation? You're interested in the capital growth. You're going to use a hold strategy then. And then you say, well, do I want to be actively involved renovating, or am I more of a lazy investor and I just want to have a build and hold investment strategy? it starts there, then you get down, and then you get into the details again and say, okay, well, let's say I want to do a renovation. Do I want to do a cash flow hack? Or do I want to do some other type of renovation? If you're using a build and hold strategy, do you want to do a progressive payment build where you're paying money over time while it's being built? Or do you want a turnkey where you don't pay the money until the end? These are all different. Of course, we've talked a lot about them on YouTube and both on the podcast as well. Right, let's wrap it up there. But please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you're listening to the podcast version, you want to see our faces while we're talking about it, you can check us out on our YouTube channel. Just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button. It really does help us get the message out to more people. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Knight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We can be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.